Hi, I'm Carol Cartwright of the Whitewater Historical Society. I'm a historian and also the volunteer curator at the Whitewater Historical Society's Museum of Local History. Today I want to talk to you about spiritualism and the Morris Pratt Institute and how it led to the Witches of Whitewater. Here is our Whitewater Historical Society building. Unfortunately, due to COVID, we're not open right now, but hopefully in the near future, that will all change and you'll be welcome to come in and look at our museum at any time. So the spiritualism all is wrapped up with a lot of the legends of Whitewater, which revolve around witches, cemeteries, and ghosts. So what are these legends? Whitewater is often referred to as Second Salem because of all the legends about witches and witches. The idea that witches have practiced in Whitewater for decades, that witches are buried, altars are buried, animals are sacrificed, etc., all at the Whitewater Water Tower, the old water tower that's in Starin Park. Also, another legend is that the locations of the three cemeteries in Whitewater form an isosceles triangle, which is a triangle that makes up the pentagram. Other legends include ghosts being drawn to this triangle and many buildings being haunted because of it. Also, a legend about a secret book so horrible that 3 people committed suicide after viewing it, and that it's kept under lock and key at the university library. Another legend is that there are tunnels all over Whitewater that were used by both the Underground Railroad, but also the witches. So what's going on historically? What I want to talk about is a link that I think to a lot of these legends in Whitewater is spiritualism. Now, what is spiritualism? Spiritualism is still practiced today, and there is an organization called the National Spiritualists Association of Churches, and this is how they define spiritualism. It is the science, philosophy, and religion of continuous life based upon the demonstrated fact of communication by means of mediumship with those who live in the spirit world. So what are the main ideas about spiritualism? The main idea is that man has a spirit and the spirit lives on after death. Now, this is similar to a lot of other religions as well. The difference is that in spiritualism, they believe that the spirits can communicate with humans on earth, that the spirits can provide insight into the mysteries of life and other natural phenomena and laws. Spiritualism has always been scientific based because the spiritualists feel that they deal with facts and manifestations that are demonstrated from the spirit world. In other words, via their practices, they have communicated with the spirits, and therefore they feel that this is a factual situation. Now, where did spiritualism come from? One of the first thinkers who discussed the idea of spirits and spiritualism was Emanuel Swedenborg, who was a Swedish scientist, and he had visions and claimed to talk to spirits. These spirits told him to go out and explain what the real meaning of the Bible was. He believed there was a connection with the spirit world and humans, and his followers started a number of churches that were based on his ideas. And these churches continued in the 19th century. There were Swedenborgian churches in the United States, and even there was one in Wisconsin at one time. Another thinker who contributed to the rise of spiritualism was Franz Anton Mesmer, an Austrian doctor. He came up with the idea that humans had a magnetic aura or fluid around them, that if you were properly trained, you could channel that aura for therapeutic purposes. In other words, healing. He would place people into a trance as part of his practice, and that's where we get the term mesmerizing from, because of Franz Mesmer. He was someone who pioneered the seances, during which some claimed to communicate with the dead. So the spiritualists kind of took that idea when they started to come up with their practices. And many mesmerists, as they were called, became the first mediums in the spiritualist movement. Now, these were Europeans, and so spiritualism started in Europe a little bit sooner than it did in the United States. But modern spiritualism in America really dates from one particular incident or event, and it dealt with the Fox sisters, who you see here. These two young women were 14 and 11 years old. They lived in upstate New York, which during the 1830s and 40s was a hotbed for all sorts of reform movements and new ideas about things. In 1848, which coincidentally was the same year they had the Women's Rights Conference, the first Women's Rights Conference in the United States, which was held in upstate New York. In that year, they heard what they called rappings or knockings at night. They decided they wanted to try to communicate with those, what they called raps, and came up with a system of yes or no answers. They would ask questions, and then they would ask the spirit to knock once for yes, twice for no, whatever system it was that they came up with. These girls were soon popular throughout this area in New York, and because this was such a hotbed for reform ideas, the idea of what they were doing, communicating with spirits, just grew tremendously. People started to believe in this idea. And it's often, the question arises, well, why these girls and why then? And what spiritualists have indicated is that at that time, the spirits were ready to communicate to the living world, and they sought out someone who they felt could understand or make sense of these communications, and that's why the Fox sisters. So why did spiritualism become so popular? Well, it was an interesting period in the 1840s and 1850s. The social and economic conditions in the United States were changing. There was a new economy based on industry. The Industrial Revolution was making an impact. Lots more immigration was coming to the United States. There was an urbanization that was happening. And of course, what I indicated before, the rise of these reform movements. At the same time, there was a decline in church attendance, but there were also new scientific ideas that challenged religious doctrines, such as the theory of evolution. Many people were also at this time obsessed with the idea of death and life after death. And this became even more significant during the Civil War, when so many young men were dying, and people had to deal with this on a day-to-day basis. So was spirit communication real? Well, that's always a question that people can judge for themselves. The spiritualists certainly believe that this communication is real. But the problem was that the spirit communication became somewhat of a fad. And so there were many fakers out there who would fake communicating with the spirits during seances and other types of activities. And a lot of people were just kind of interested in the whole idea of seances. They thought they were kind of fun, and so they would go for entertainment purposes and not for real spiritualist purposes. But serious spiritualists always believed in the mediums and in spirit communications. Now, was there activity on spiritualism in Whitewater? Yes, there was a lot of activity between the 1850s and 1890 and beyond in Whitewater. A lot of people who came to Whitewater came from upstate New York, where a lot of these reform movements were in vogue at the time. And so they had communications with people in upstate New York, and so they got these ideas very quickly and wanted to participate as well. So a couple examples from the newspaper. In 1861, E.V. Wilson, a noted spiritualist, lectured, gave a demonstration of what he called clairvoyance. In 1872, a nationally known spiritualist, J.M. Peebles, lectured with the Madison spiritualist J.O. Barrett in Whitewater. Known spiritualists lived in Whitewater in the mid-19th century. One of the most interesting was Juliet Severance. She lived briefly in Whitewater, and she was a female physician, which was rare at the time. At that time, there were many types of medical practices, and one of these practices included hydropathy, or what they called the water cure. And Juliet Severance was an advocate of this water cure. She was also very interested in women-centered medicine. At the time, a lot of women were hesitant to see male doctors, and a lot of male doctors treated women poorly in terms of medical care. So she set out to be someone who could help women with her hydropathy practices. She was also a firm believer in women's rights and free love. Now, free love is not the free love as we think of it today. Free love meant that women would have free choice over who they married, when they married. A lot of people in that time in the 19th century were engaged in arranged marriages, or once they married, had no choice whether to stay or leave the marriage. There was no equality in a marriage. So her idea was that love and equality without any kind of legal or religious sanction was appropriate for women. And it was all part of the women's rights movement that was getting started at this time. Later on in Whitewater, we have an example of a spiritualist who came to Whitewater kind of as an entertainer. And this was very common. This was in 1885. Annie Eva Fay was a nationally known spiritualist. She was advertised as the Phantom Princess. She gave entertaining exhibitions of spiritualist practices. And whether she was serious about her spiritualism, it's not clear. But certainly, even into the late 19th century, there was an interest in this kind of activity and entertainment in Whitewater. Which brings us to Morris Pratt. He was born in 1820 in, surprise, surprise, upstate New York. He came to the town of Lima with his family in 1840 and became a successful farmer. Now, he came during this pioneer era where farmers grew a lot of wheat, and they could make a lot of money off of growing wheat at that period. And so he was one of the farmers that made a lot of money with this. And eventually he sold his farm and made money off of that as well. He lived in the city or the village of Milton for a while before coming to Whitewater. But what's most interesting about Morris Pratt is he joined spiritualist circles in the area in the mid-19th century. As soon as spiritualism came to Wisconsin, he was involved in it. The person that he was primarily involved with was a woman named Mary Hayes, later Chynoweth. She was a medium in the Lake Mills area during the mid-19th century. And she became very popular and had a circuit or a circle of followers that she lectured with, she held seances, and also in particular was a spiritual healer, which leads back to the whole Franz Mesmer idea. Morris Pratt was a real devoted member of her circle, and he attended her lectures and seances. Now, the story goes that she advised him in a seance to invest in iron mines in northern Wisconsin. Well, just coincidentally, those iron mines were owned by her sons. But it wasn't a bad investment because her sons actually opened the most prolific iron mines in that entire area during the 19th century. So while it was probably of interest to her that people invested in these iron mines, they really did pan out, and it wasn't a bad investment. He agreed to invest with the promise that he would build a temple to spiritualism with any of the profits. Well, he made money, and that's exactly what he did. This is a picture of Morris Pratt's Temple of Psychic Science. That was the original name for the building. It was started in April of 1888 and dedicated in April of 1889. And it took a year to build because it was actually a very large building. I think it was the only building larger at the time would have been the old main building at the normal school, which is now, of course, UW-Whitewater. The building included living quarters for Pratt and others, large meeting halls, and classrooms where people could learn about spiritualism and practice spiritualism. Now, Morris Pratt was kind of close-lipped about the whole purpose of his building. I don't know if people were really sure that this was associated with spiritualism, but people in Whitewater thought this was great. He was building this huge 3-story building, and it probably was going to bring money to the community, so everyone was for it. And so they turned out in large numbers when the building was dedicated. But many were shocked at the lectures that were given at the dedication. And these lectures included very severe criticisms of mainstream religion and how spiritualism was better. So that was kind of a little bit of a surprise, and may have turned off a number of people in the community, although in general they supported the Temple of Science. So what did they do there at the Temple of Science? Well, a main activity there were lectures. And one of the most popular lecturer at in Whitewater, according to the newspaper, she came many times, was Amelia Colby Luther of Indiana. And she gave a lot of interesting lectures. I've listed a few here: spiritual culture and how to promote it. Is matter indestructible, or does death end all? And the true and false in mediumship, which would have been an important conversation because you would want to know who was a serious medium and who was not. One of the most common activities at the Temple of Science was a seance. And in this case, I found a notice that was a seance advertised in the newspaper, and it apparently was for the public. A lot of the seances were private, but this was a public one. And I don't know how many of public seances there were, but certainly that was common because seances were the most important spiritualist practice. Seances were led by a medium, and through this medium, the spirits would communicate important information. So the mediums would kind of start the seance, would conduct the seance throughout, and attempt to communicate with spirits. Now, sometimes these spirits would be general spirits who would give general information, but many other mediums also communicated with spirits related to the seance participants. Another activity that was held at the Temple of Science was another form of spirit communication, which is called slate writing or automatic writing. And this was one of the ways that many mediums communicated with spirits. What they would do is they would have a slate, an old slate like you see in the old primary, old one-room schoolhouse, historic buildings. And the medium would turn the slate upside down, not looking at it, and would write what the spirit told him or her without looking at it. Or sometimes they would put it under the table upside down, or do other kinds of ways in which they would get writing on that slate. One of the more important activities that seemed to occur at the Temple of Science during the early period was spirit healing. And this was probably because Morris Pratt was such a so devoted to Mary Chynoweth, and she was so involved in spirit healing. That was a very important activity. There were often lectures by spirit healers. But what was really interesting is through the newspaper notices, I found that people sometimes stayed at the Temple of Science when they were ill to receive continuous spirit healing as well. So this was one of the most important things that they would do at the Temple of Science. Now, I touched on this earlier about Morris Pratt and Whitewater. It was an interesting relationship because during his lifetime, there were occasional conflicts with the community. In one case, there was a revival or a series of revival meetings, as shown in this article. And Morris Pratt, he could be disagreeable or arrogant, and he often challenged local ministers or pastors to debate the superiority of spiritualism. And well, he did this at this one revival, and apparently the argument got so heated that the revival leader physically threw Pratt out of the revival. Well, there was a legal case, and Pratt said he had an injury, etc., and it was finally all settled out of court. But this was partly because Morris Pratt was so seriously a believer in spiritualism that he made these challenges to local people, almost like an evangelist himself. But I think in the majority of cases, based on what you read in the newspaper, the community in general respected him for doing what he was doing at his Temple of Science, even while they often talked about it as Spook's Temple, which of course refers to the seances and conjuring up the spirits. The Temple of Science operated as a temple, a church-like building, or an educational institute of sorts, until 1902. In that year, Morris Pratt was in failing health, and he wanted his Temple of Science to continue on. He decided that he would deed the building to a Spiritualist School Association. The association had plans to open a school for both general education and spiritualist studies. Now, this would be at the high school, late high school to post high school level. In 1902, a lot of people still did not complete high school. So it was often the case that they would go to various institutes or academies later on to get additional education. And so this Spiritualist School Association wanted to offer both a general education path and a course of study for people who wanted to be involved in spiritualism. This happened after Morris Pratt died in December of 1902. He was 81 years old. So the school association that took over set up these two educational opportunities. The first part was a general educational plan, which was open to the public. It had topics, as you see here, grammar, literature, history, etc., that would be similar to, again, a late high school or a early college education. However, the spiritualist studies were only open to serious spiritualists who wanted to work in spiritualist churches or in the field of spiritualism in general. And these courses included psychic research, which was a study of the spirit world, specifically centering on seances and spirit communication. They studied comparative religion. They studied evolution because they were very scientific in their beliefs. And interestingly enough, they studied the Bible as it pertained to spiritualism beliefs. One of the reasons they, I believe, studied the Bible was at this time, many spiritualists were also Christians at the same time, or former Christians. And the head of the Morris Pratt Institute at this time was Moses Hull. He was probably the most notable spiritualist writer and lecturer in the United States at that time. And he helped keep the Institute running by continuing to lecture and fundraise throughout the United States for the Morris Pratt Institute. He had been a former Christian minister and was one of who I call Christian spiritualists or Christian-based spiritualists. In other words, they sort of believed in both doctrines at the same time. It was Moses Hull and his leadership that really helped the Morris Pratt Institute become successful in Whitewater. So where was the Morris Pratt Institute? It was located on the corner of Center Street and Fremont Street. There is a telephone company building. If you're old enough to remember when there used to be an office there for the telephone company, now it just probably contains equipment related to the few of us who still have landlines. But that was the location where it was, across from the Premier Bank. Well, spiritualism eventually declined in the United States, and it started that decline probably around 1900 and generally declined into the 1930s. And of course, the 1930s was the era of the Great Economic Depression in the United States. And so many people at that time were more interested in where they were going to buy their next meal rather than something like spiritualism and speaking with spirits. At that time, there was a decline in students at the Institute. They usually had maybe a couple dozen students at a time at the Institute, but that declined because just like any other college, they had to pay tuition, and so there were fewer jobs available. A lot of them were working their way through college just like other students did, and so there was a lack of students during the 1930s. Eventually, the Institute closed for good in 1939 in Whitewater, but it didn't die out completely. It reopened later in the Milwaukee suburb of Wauwatosa, and there is a building that is still standing called the Morris Pratt Institute in Wauwatosa, and it is still in operation today. So what happened after the Pratt Institute closed? Well, it stayed vacant for a while. In the late 1940s, it was used as College House, a woman's dormitory. The first dormitory for the normal school, or what is now UW-Whitewater, was not built until 1952. And enrollments after World War II were increasing, and there was a need for students, particularly women students, to have a dormitory that would cater just to their needs. So that occurred, that women students were housed there for a few years until 1952, when the women's dormitories were started on campus. Then again, it stayed vacant for a number of years. For a while, it was thought that they could remodel the building into a hospital, but that never came about. The building by this time was very old. It had few modern conveniences, and so it just wasn't very useful for any kind of reuse. So in 1961, it was sold to the telephone company for their new switching station for landlines and an office where you could pay your telephone bills. So how do we get from mediums to witches? This is something I've been thinking about for the many years that I've been looking into the Morris Pratt Institute and talking about spiritualism, and also knowing about the legends of Whitewater. Well, this is what I think might have happened. From the earliest times of spiritualism, there was an association with witchcraft. And this advertisement that I'm showing here is from the 19th century. And already they're talking about spiritualism and witchcraft kind of in the same breath. Many thought communicating with the dead was satanic, that was part of an occult practice. Some thought that when a medium was in a trance, she was possessed by the devil. And the Fox sisters eventually were called the descendants of the Salem witches. So there was this idea of witchcraft right from the get-go. In Whitewater, many pastors, many ministers preached against spiritualism. Here's an example from 1871 that the pastor of the Methodist Church was going to give a lecture equating spiritualism with ancient sorcery and modern witchcraft. So even in Whitewater, the idea of that this was associated with witchcraft was prevalent. Now, the other reason that I think spiritualism gets associated with witches was because it was dominated by women. Spiritualism was associated with women more than any other religion. Mainly because women were seen as preferred mediums. They were seen as being more sensitive to spirit communication. Also, women maintained high-level positions in spiritualism, unlike in mainstream religions. Being a medium or a lecturer on spiritualism or being in the hierarchy of that religion was considered by many to be outside the sphere that women were expected to be in the 19th and early 20th century. For example, women were expected to be wives, mothers, homemakers, and religious in the mainstream religions. Some people felt that women in spiritualism was actually femininity gone awry. And then there were some famous spiritualists, women, who were advocates not only of spiritualism, but of other what was felt were radical ideas, such as women's rights, women's suffrage, and of course, the free love idea. Women with these beliefs were thought to be notorious by the general public. This is Victoria Woodhull. She was a spiritualist. She was divorced, an advocate of free love, an advocate of women's rights, and ran for president 3 times. So she was, in particular, considered a notorious woman. And so her association as a spiritualist just fed into that whole belief that this was something odd that women were involved in that they maybe shouldn't be involved in. But despite that, the Spiritualists of Whitewater were not witches. But I think that's where many people made the leap from women mediums to witches. Because if you thought what they were doing was occult in nature, then what was a representation of a female who practiced occult practices? It was the witch. But in Whitewater, they were definitely not witches. They were definitely not Satanists. They believed in God or a higher power. And as I said earlier, many at the Morris Pratt Institute were not just spiritualists, but they were also Christians. They felt that they could believe in both doctrines at the same time. But what's very interesting and important in regard to the Morris Pratt Temple of Science and later the Institute was that they were part of a significant social movement of the late 19th century. This wasn't just Whitewater that was doing this, although this was unique in Whitewater in that there was this Temple of Science and that there was this Spiritualist Institute. Spiritualism was extremely popular throughout the United States in the 19th century, the mid to late 19th century. And by looking at spiritualism, by looking at Morris Pratt's Institute, you can gain a lot of information about Victorian life. What did these people believe, and how did their beliefs manifest themselves in the way they lived? So Morris Pratt and his Spiritualist Temple Institute was unique, it was important, and a very interesting part of the history of spiritualism, and therefore a very interesting and fascinating part of the history of Whitewater. Thank you very much for listening to my talk and watching my talk virtually. If you have any questions, the Whitewater Historical Society has a website, whitewaterhistoricalsociety.org, and we have an extended article about Morris Pratt on our website, as well as contact information for myself or anything else you want to know about the Whitewater Historical Society. So I appreciate you tuning in today, and hopefully we'll be able to do it again sometime.